Welcome to the city of 100 spires, the capital city of the Czech Republic and home to 1.3 million people. This is the historic city of Prague. Now, Prague's history has been punctuated by floods, and some really major floods as well. However, it's also a story of how the city forgot about those floods and the damage that they did until they were very starkly reminded of it again in 2002. Now join me on this tour of the city as I go around different areas affected by that flood and tell you the story of floods in Prague. So I'm here on Charles Bridge, which is a really famous Prague landmark. This is normally full of tourists and I've had to get up really early to come down here. And you can still see there's quite a lot of people. There's people doing photo shoots and all sorts of things here. This bridge was actually built to replace an older bridge, the Joshua Bridge, which was destroyed by a flood in 1342. So this bridge dates back to the 14th century, which you can really see is kind of Gothic and old look to it. It crosses a river called the Vltava, which means wild water, which sources in the Bohemian Mountains up in the north over there. And if you follow it down south, it kind of bisects the Czech Republic and joins with the River Elbe, which will eventually flow through Dresden and Hamburg and into the North Sea. So I'm on the banks of the river. I'm just slightly north of Charles Bridge, which you can see over there. And we've got Old Town, which is just behind this building to the east. And Old Town is an area of beautiful old Gothic buildings, which is the historical heart of the city. A lot of valuable places there, a lot of valuable books and artwork are stored in that area. So naturally, when the floods came and they got the flood warnings on August 12, 2002, they wanted to defend that area. And they did this by using temporary flood defences, which they'd pre-planned. And as you can see along this wall, there are metal posts and devices which allow them to mount these temporary flood defences. And when they're put up, they look like walls of sheet metal and literally just use a brute force to stop floodwater getting through into the Old Town. And this was initially successful, the Old Town that was believed to be saved by flooding. And since then, they've expanded the use of temporary flood defences across the city of Prague. So I'm right back in the heart of Prague, in the centre of the Old Town area, just up from where we just saw those temporary flood defences. And even though those barriers did stop the river overtopping and flooding this area, water doesn't just flow on the surface. And actually during those floods, because the water level rose so much, the water table, so that water underground, actually rose as well. And that blocked off and overwhelmed the city's wastewater and sewage system, causing a lot of kind of secondary flooding around these buildings. 90% of the buildings in the Old Town had their basements flooded, and this caused an immense amount of damage. So I'm now outside the city's synagogue in the Jewish quarter area of the city, and this is one of the areas which was really, really badly hit by flooding. Now, a lot of old historic landmark buildings like the synagogue were really badly affected by flooding. They were inundated with water quite deeply, and that meant a lot of books and a lot of artwork and a lot of artifacts were damaged by the floodwater. Now, one of the solutions the city came up with for this is to freeze those items, to freeze the water in those items until they could get them so they could be restored and dried out. So I've come down to the banks of the Vltava River here. I've just got the Czech Bridge behind me. I've come to the opposite bank to Old Town, which is just over there. And just further back in the distance is the Charles Bridge. Now I've come here because I wanted to show you the river. It's nice and calm and still today, although I imagine it is exceptionally deep. You can see how high the walls and the banks are on either side, so just imagine how much water needed to come down here to flood the city. So the size of that flood is what we'd call a 1 in 100 year flood, or to use the more modern terminology, it is a 1% annual exceedance probability. So there's a 1% chance of a flood of that magnitude happening each year. The peak of the flood was 5,200 cubic meters of water flowing through here every second. 5,200 cubic. It's an astonishing amount of water. And the cause of that was not one, but actually two storms. So these formed in August 2002 over the Mediterranean Sea. Two areas of low pressure, lots of rain in them. The first one, a few days earlier than the second one, dumped its water all over the Bohemian area of the Czech Republic, which soaked the land and swelled the rivers. So when that second storm came in, there was nowhere else for that water to go but through the rivers and through the city. Now this is really significant for us as flood modelers, because we tend to just model a single storm, the effect of a single storm on a river. And as you can see what happened in Prague, if we just use that approach in our modelling, we wouldn't be able to pick up that flooding. We need to really be able to look at the effects of multiple storms in one go, so we can use techniques like continuous simulation, which allow us to do that. Now Prague has a really good public transport system made up of trams, buses, and also the metro, which is the underground train. And I'm here in Malostranska, which means lesser town, across the bank from the old town, which is a really good interchange. You've got trams which come up here, and there's also a metro station over there as well. Now the metro system was thought to be flood-proof. The Czechs really thought that the resilience of their metro system was superb. They actually planned to use it as a nuclear fallout shelter during the Cold War. However, during the floods in 2002, this proved not to be right, and 29 of those metro stations flooded, including Malostranska here in the background, which was described as actually being like at the bottom of a pond. They actually brought the transport system of Prague to its knees. It very nearly collapsed, and since then there's been a lot of work put in to build additional stronger walls to stop these stations from flooding again. So following the floods in 2002, those temporary defences which were just put onto the opposite bank over there to defend the old town were determined to be so successful that they've been rolled out all over the city. And we can see now in the Malostranska area, I'm stood on these mountings for temporary defences which can be deployed now if there is going to be another flood, which will protect all this area here, which was very badly flooded in 2002. So the impacts of the flooding on Prague were huge, and it's left scars across the city since 2002. Very sadly, 19 people lost their lives during this flooding. 1,000 homes were demolished or needed to be demolished, and 40,000 people were evacuated during the flood. In the zoo just up the river from here, 134 animals very sadly lost their lives as well, including a sea lion called Gaston, who became a symbol of hope for the city immediately after the floods, because they escaped and they swam down the river and were eventually found a few days later in Dresden, but subsequently died of infection and exhaustion. The story of this sea lion had such an impact on the city, there was actually a statue to the sea lion in the zoo now. So Prague, like many areas, has flood-rich and flood-poor times. So these cycles where you have periods where there's lots of floods and periods where there's not so many floods. And they had a really rich flood period between 1845 and 1890, where the city flooded regularly. But since 1890, the city went nearly 120 years without any major floods. And this kind of made the people of the city forget what happened, and they weren't really prepared for that flood in 2002. Now, the memories of floods, you can see these kind of dotted around different areas of cities like Prague, and you can see these flood markers on the wall behind me. So this lowest one here is from 1890, and the top one here shows the really high flood levels that were here in 2002. So I'm up in the Malostrana area again. This is an area which is really popular with tourists. There are a lot of shops and cafes and bars which are targeting tourists. I can smell the wonderful aroma of the cinnamon bread baking on those chimney ice cream waffles that people love over here. If you're out here, try one, they're really nice. But all these tourists actually present a problem when it comes to emergency planning and trying to warn people of flooding. Because most of these people, they won't be able to speak the Czech language. They won't have signed up for warnings. So it's really difficult to get the alerts out and the information to people who are not here most of the time and just passing through or on holiday. One of the things we've been doing in the UK to try and get this is to actually push alerts out using the mobile phone masts. So everybody in a specific area gets an automatic alert whether they've signed up to it or not, although there is an opt-out. And this makes sure that we can get those messages out and make them available in different languages, so people who are not normally in the area but are in the area when the flood alerts come through can get warnings. So this is the whole Ceviche area of the city, which is one of the main residential areas in the city centre, and it was an area which was really badly flooded in 2002. Now, one of the things which is said about this area is this was before 2002, this was one of the poorest areas, and the flood offered it a chance to be regenerated and revived and renovated, and now it's one of the most up and coming and desirable areas to live. And you may hear this term as something like build back better, but actually, even though the neighbourhood has been renovated and improved, it's not necessarily the same people living in this area. The people who were flooded in 2002 probably now can't afford to live in this area. So when you hear terms like build back better, it's really important to be critical and ask, who are you building back better for? So I'm up here in the National Gallery in Prague, an exhibit for the Prague Quadrennial Conference, which is why I'm in the city. And I just want to reflect on what I've seen from my flood tour around Prague, and it's really about this notion of resilience. So the city went 120 years without a flood, and it meant that the people who lived in the city and the people who were planning for flooding had no real lived experience of flooding, and they weren't really prepared for it when it came. The systems hadn't been tested. You know, they thought the metro was unfloodable, and it flooded. Since then, they've managed to do a lot of work to make the city more resilient to flooding, so if it did happen again, they'd be more prepared for it. And it just kind of demonstrates how it's really hard to build the resilience of a place to flooding when it hasn't experienced flooding. And it's a real challenge that we've got as planners. So I've hoped you enjoyed this flood this flood tour of Prague. I hope to bring you more of these in the future, but please do make sure you've liked this video and subscribe to the channel below. And remember, stay dry out there.